Hello, I'm Liesl Riddle, and I'm the Dean of the College of Professional Studies and Associate Professor of International Business and International Affairs. Before this role, I served as Vice Dean for Strategy in our School of Business, where I had the opportunity to launch a new MBA program in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security in Security Technology Transition. In the College of Professional Studies, I'm very proud to oversee our GW Cyber Academy, which includes workforce development boot camps, bachelor completion degree programs, master's degree programs, and executive education programs. For our next session, we'll hear from Meg King, Executive Director for Strategy, Policy Coordination, and Innovation for the Transportation Security Administration, an agency within the Department of Homeland Security. Amanda Suárez, Senior Strategy Advisor in the White House Office of the National Cyber Director. And Connie Uthoff, Program Director of the Cybersecurity Strategy and Information Management Master's Program in our College of Professional Studies, and author of Cyber Intelligence, Actors, Policies, Practices, and a contributor to United States Cybersecurity Magazine. Chris Kaminsky, CEO of cyber and homeland security firm Kaminsky Strategic Solutions, LLC, will serve as our moderator today. Now we'll have 45 minutes for this session. A polite reminder that each of our sessions are part of a full day-long schedule, and our speakers are on a tight schedule. So I request that the audience be seated before each session starts, as we'll not have the flexibility for a delayed start. If time permits, we'll go ahead and take some audience questions. Please remember to submit your questions via Pigeonhole so our moderators will be able to see them. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Dean, thank you so much, and we're glad to be kicking off the afternoon session. Hope you had a nice lunch and that you're awake and alive for the conversation we're about to engage in. As with the rest of the program, we have a phenomenal panel today that spans academia, government, corporations, national non-governmental organizations, and so we're really pleased to have such an expert group of individuals to talk about the national strategy and its implications and what that means for industry and also other players on the landscape. So thank you, Dean, for the introductions. I appreciate getting us started with that. And since we're on a tight time frame over the course of the day, we want to stay tight with the schedule and jump right into this. So I'd like to start with Amanda. Amanda, you're at the White House, and you've got a lot of colleagues that have been working on this strategy. Obviously, two of the pillars that people have been talking about is the regulatory structure, a little more aggressive than in past iterations that have come out, but also this notion of the offensive nature of looking at how that also plays into the strategy. We're all excited to see this on the street, and we know you've got an implementation plan, but can you kick us off and talk a little bit about the strategy and what went into it and where we're headed?
Definitely, yeah. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the GW community for being here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to talk about ONCD. So I come from the Office of the National Cyber Director within the White House, and our office's mission is really to ensure that all communities are able to thrive and prosper in our digital ecosystem. And so that's really the driving force behind the work that we do. And so when we were tasked with leading the interagency process to develop the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was just signed last month by the president, we really wanted to approach and provide a new kind of fresh take to the challenges and the opportunities that we see in the digital ecosystem. And so that really comes down to two fundamental shifts that you see in the strategy. And really the first is that we want to lift and shift the burden of responsibility in cyberspace from the most vulnerable actors. And so, that means my grandfather from Puerto Rico is not going toe-to-toe against the most sophisticated ransomware criminals in Russia, for example, and that is an unequitable and unjust division of responsibility, and that instead we need to call on the more capable, most well-resourced actors in our ecosystem, from cloud service providers to the federal government, to really step in and kind of lift that burden of responsibility. And then the second shift is to realign incentives to look towards long-term investment. And so that means when a company, an entity is faced with the trade-offs of a short-term fix versus a durable long-term solution, they are given kind of those resources to incentivize them to choose the longer-term fixed. And so that those two shifts are really what animates the strategy, and you can see that across the different pillars, ranging from defensive critical infrastructure to disrupting, dismantling threat actors, also looking at how to shape market forces to drive resilience, and then looking to also how we look at that in an international context and kind of forging partnerships. And so I know Chris mentioned the question of regulation and harmonization, and so those are some of the core precepts, but really these shifts are what kind of permeates the strategy. And now that it's out, we are very much focused on implementation and really looking to move and translate these vision and this kind of affirmative look that the administration's put forth into reality. And so that's kind of the driving force of our office today. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's exciting to have it out on the street. I mean, there's been a lot of reaction to it, obviously. Being just 5 blocks from 1600, Connie, you've watched a lot of this unfold through the years in partnerships with the university, but also in your work and your writings. What's your take on the strategy itself, and how does it compare or differ from things that you've seen in the past?
Oh, well, first of all, as Amanda mentioned, she was talking about some of the changes, significant changes that are have been applied to this strategy. When you look back to the Biden administration, and then you look farther back through the Trump administration when they put forth their strategy, and all the way back to the Bush administration, there are some similar themes that carry through. There are similar themes that have to do with critical infrastructure protection. Partnerships, public-private partnerships, is reinforcing that in this document as well. Some other, if we look back even to the Trump administration, to this administration, we're still talking about the same 4 adversaries, the major adversaries: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So some of those things are still carried through in this document. But as Amanda mentioned, there's those significant changes that have to do with responsibility and the shifting of responsibility. So it's a really big move for that. And I think I really commend the people who have put this together, because they're bold changes, they're important changes. And if you take a look at when this strategy was being developed, it was right after the solar winds breach. It was right after the Colonial Pipeline breach. It was right after, as Ukraine, the whole conflict that happened in Ukraine when Russia was, and each one of them has very significant national security implications as well as international implications. So these things are being addressed in this new strategy that just came out, and they're really important to take a look at. And as you go through each pillar and start to look at and uncover, so you'll see that some of those things have already been starting to be implemented. And you take a look at hunting forward, or you take a look at some of the different types of collaboration, they're already occurring. So if you listen to some of the people from Amanda's office who have been talking about this document, they've already been saying, no, we're already starting the work. We're already, the implementation is already starting. And there'll be more about that probably during the summer, we hope. But those are some great things that I saw, some differences and some similarities. So they keep some of the important components that have been, all the way back at the Bush administration when that first cyber strategy came out to today, and then the new ones, the new things that you've developed, and are really amazing changes and very welcome changes.
That's great insight, especially across the administrations. You've seen a lot of pieces of these things come out. Meg, Secretary Mayorkas often says that DHS is a department of partnerships, right? And nowhere is that more evident probably than at TSA, where you're on the front line, not only with the passenger, with the traveling public, but also with the industry, the airlines, and all that. You're on the front edge of this, being the first ones out. Connie mentioned Colonial. How has that process gone? Industry on the receiving end of a lot of this, in a very tight time frame and window. What are your feelings about how this has unfolded so far?
So it won't surprise anyone here that the transportation sector is vast. And so we protect both physical and digital infrastructure. We don't own all of it, to your point. In fact, we own very little of it as a government. But we have incredible insight into how those sectors and subsectors function. So to break it down a little bit for this group, there are surface transportation, so that includes everything above ground, trains, both freight and passenger, that includes above the ground trucks, cars, you name it. Then there's also aviation, which is pretty obvious, and we're well known for that because we are very physically present as you travel throughout airports across the country. Obviously, there are some significant vulnerabilities. There was a ransomware attack which had an impact on an IT system, not an operational technology system, but it still ended up closing off gas and natural gas to the east coast of the United States. What we've learned since that time, when we used some of our regulatory authority to provide some more prescriptive list of here are the key things we'd like you to do as companies in these sectors, pipelines as well, we learned that that wasn't really the best approach, and that a more outcome-focused here is what we think your companies or owners and operators, your critical systems should be protected, how they should be protected. You tell us, because you know your own systems best, you know your networks, you know your architectures, and then we'll help you verify it. And what we've done is, as the cyber threats, as has been mentioned, have changed, many of the threat actors haven't, and their intentions have become more clear. So we've taken a closer look at the evolution of the threats on the transportation sector, and I don't need to tell this audience, because a lot of it's open source, about kind of how those methods might be carried out. So as we've done that, and as the national strategy has come out, identifying that we need some smarter regulations, TSA and the administrator has been really forward-leaning in this space, and has kind of done two things. One, move from more prescriptive to outcome-focused measures, and two, has brought in industry in a way that we hadn't in the past. Technical roundtables, talk to us with your CEOs and your CISOs. We've given them intelligence briefs to kind of show what we know as a government from a strategic standpoint, not necessarily a tactical standpoint. But how do we work with you as owners, operators, companies? And some of these are a blend, which makes it very complicated, of private industry and municipalities, as in, for example, airports are sometimes owned by towns and cities. And so it's this unique blend of legal and regulatory frameworks that we have to balance while ultimately achieving that goal of the strategy, where we don't expect that a company or even a smaller government should be able to protect themselves from a nation-state adversary.
That's really good. Amanda, with regard to the meetings, you guys had a lot of meetings with industry in advance, right? You wanted to make sure that they were at the table. I know that Ann Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, came out recently and said that there are some of the sectors, as many as 5, that may need some additional help. How are you kind of rationalizing across the 16 and making sure that you've got some uniformity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Chris. And I think, speaking a lot to Meg's points that she's bringing up of when we look at regulation, we want it to be light touch. We want it to be cognizant of a sector and kind of the specific unique nature of a sector, for it to be developed in a collaborative manner with the private sector, with critical infrastructure owners and operators, and also, most critically, harmonized with existing regulation to understand and make sure that we're not creating new standards or duplicating existing requirements on sectors. And so those are some of the tenets that have really been drawn out in the strategy and how we approach regulatory harmonization. And I would just say, in terms of critical infrastructure, we would suggest for current, operators, owners to really look to CISA's cybersecurity performance goals. That's a great framework to really look at across sectors, kind of baseline requirements and measures that entities can take now. And in terms of engagement on the implementation of the strategy, we are working closely with the interagency on kind of an implementation framework that will be released in the summer, and we would really encourage those interested parties to reach out if your department or agency is specifically named in the strategy of covering a specific issue set that you are most involved in. ONCD does own some clearly enumerated roles in the strategy that we are driving forth in its implementation, and so some of that has already been begun, as Connie had mentioned. So to reach out to us, because we want to continue that very close consultative approach of collaboration to really have more meaningful outcomes. So, yeah.
Good, thank you. Connie, you're, as I mentioned, you're on the front lines with the students, right? You're educating a next generation, and while it's not directly involved in the strategy itself, workforce across the federal agencies is an important thing. And as we sit in a premier university setting here at GW, what are you seeing in the classroom? What are you seeing in the research that might add itself to the environment that we're in today?
Oh, definitely. Well, definitely in our classroom, we have some students that are already on the master's level. They're already working professionally. Many of them are already working in some of the different agencies that we're talking about here. And they do have a lot of great ideas, a lot of great insight into what is going on, and some great recommendations about how to move forward. Also, just in terms of workforce development, that is an area that really we need a lot of attention, and we need to think of some different ways to be able to incentivize workers on both the public and private sector. So that's a really important piece of all of that, absolutely.
Oh, that's a great segue into, Meg, we talked about on the phone the other day about the importance of the R&D structure, particularly at DHS. As they stood up the new R&D Council, but each of the components has their own view of how this is going to unfold. What's your sense of that, how it's coming together, and how important is it to the success of the initiative and the White House strategy?
Critical, and I have strategy in my own policy team's name, and so as well as risk. So as part of that portfolio, we are working with CISA, we are working with the Science and Tech Directorate, who owns that research and development, those dollars in the national labs, to think forward about the longer term pieces to this puzzle that the strategy calls out. So for example, one of the issues we hear from those that we interact with in industry and the transportation sector is, I can protect my network, but I am still reliant on third-party vendors, whether it's hardware or software. You can't make, in most cases, all of your own products. You can't necessarily ensure that all the software that you're using is without vulnerability. So we are working to assess the risk in the first place, to create some models to target really where in the surface and aviation sectors, where we need to target our resources, our time, and our expertise. And then once we kind of have that, which will feed in some data from a lot of the regulatory efforts we're doing now, then we're also trying to work on projects where we test out vulnerabilities at scale on hardware systems, on software, so that eventually we can get to a place where software is built with more security by design, so that we're not in this kind of forever cat and mouse situation, and that our hardware and software is more resilient. And that's ultimately the goal, is that if there's a breach of some sort, an access point, that the adversary can't pivot, can't move to take command and control, or to restrict the authorization. There are just a lot of things that we can be doing in the longer term. And without research and development dollars specifically targeted in the transportation sector, that will be harder. As most of you know, I mean, trains are reliant on, for example, signaling capabilities. There are a lot of these operational technology capabilities. Pipelines, clearly, as we mentioned earlier, have valves that are controlled remotely, and those things are often very old and very expensive to change out, because to do that, you have to take down sometimes the system, which means it costs money. And so it's not like in the IT world where you can just kind of patch a system and you're up to date. It gets really complicated quickly. And so the more we can build in security by design, work with vendors who are not necessarily part of our regulated ecosystem to build in some new capabilities, some harder wired sensors, then we will be in a better place.
Sticking with that thread, Amanda and Connie, we have a question from the audience that's along the same lines. Implementing a plan is always a challenge. Money and authorities are unclear at this point. Can the panelists paint a better picture of what comes next in terms of the staging as we move down the path on this?
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think that is a very good question that ONCD was built to really respond to. And so our office was formed as on recommendation by the Bipartisan Solarium Commission, and formed in 2021 with that NDAA. And so the design of our office is really to be able to have the resources to look forward. And we house within our office budgeteers who have that kind of seasoned experience of working with OMB, working with Congress, with the private sector, to really understand how do you align resources to aspirations. And that is really a critical function of our office, to be able to say, we have this great idea on paper, but what does that actually look like in terms of personnel or dollars and investment in the future? And so you can see, as part of the strategy, we're really looking to invest in resilience as one of the pillars. And so you can see in many administration initiatives, from the CHIPS and Science Act to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the Inflation Reduction Act, an emphasis on baking in security by design into new technologies, particularly in clean energy, to understand how we are making sure to have that at the ground level when we're providing grants to different state, local governments toward green energy projects. And so one thing that I would just highlight that our office has recently hosted was in the fall, we had an electric vehicle executive forum where we brought together CEOs of charging stations, of electric vehicle companies, to the table with our science and technology folks from across the federal government, and really sat them down and presented a threat brief of this is what the cybersecurity risks are when it comes to the power grid, and kind of what happens when we have a widespread network of charging stations or electric vehicles plugging into the power grid, and really presented them that information, and then had a discussion about, okay, what outcomes do we need to drive for? How do we ensure that these funding that is coming through the administration is really including an attention towards cybersecurity. And so that's one way that we're making sure that resources are aligned to some of the broader vision in the strategy.
Yeah, and I find the strategy really amazing because it does address some initial concerns, but then it has a long range, and in terms of implementation, it will take time. It's not all going to happen overnight. If anyone's looked at some of the pillars that have to do with quantum computers and what's coming into the future and how are we going to be ready for that when, quantum computers and what the implications are for encryption for the future. And that's a big lift. So things like that in the strategy, again, there's things that are already being taken care of now, and then there are things for the future. And so there's a place for people. When we talk about workforce and we think about opportunities and incentives, so one thing the government has is a purse that they can use for incentives. They can use part of their strategy is realigning incentives using regulation, but also using grants and other things to incentivize organizations and people and companies to also be part of this future planning. And there's other things that are already being taken care of as well that are being done within, if you look at the strategy in terms of disrupting and dismantle. We already have the FBI, the ransomware is a big thing, and the FBI has already gone and worked in partnership with their European partners, the Dutch and the Germans, to take down and dismantle a ransomware group. There's also, again, Cybercom and the Department of Defense is doing hunt forward operations and all of that. So we're talking about, when you look at the strategy, they talk about all of the elements of power. So, and that's also consistent in the last strategy. We talk about using all of our elements of power at our disposal to be able to support these initiatives and also to be able to add layers of protection. So it's not just, these small steps, but there's a lot that's to that strategy. So it's very exciting. It's exciting for what they've put out there. It's exciting for a vision for the future. And it's also saying, wow, there are some things coming that we really need to be prepared for. So we should all, roll up our sleeves and get together and do it. So.
Well, this audience has brought its A game today. A lot of good questions here flowing in on the iPad here. Meg, let's go back to this public-private partnership issue for a second, because the next question on the list here goes to the issue of data sharing. A lot of technology at the checkpoints. You're rolling out CT scanning, which is a big deal for the administrator and the organization. You've got the CAT reading that's also flowing out there. A lot of issues around information sharing, not only in TSA, but across the components of DHS and beyond. What's your thinking around what's happened beneficially of late, and what are some challenges that might still exist?
So on the benefits, we have a better way, as you mentioned, credentialing. We have a better way to identify you are who you say you are by your face, and by doing that, we have. There are a number of. It would probably surprise this group, or maybe it wouldn't, that there are a number of people, bad actors, who continue to be able to create false credentials, and they are very convincing. But if you use a technology that is very limited in the data that it shares, in fact, that it goes back to a gallery of photographs in which you already have given your photograph to for example, DMV for your ID. It goes back to a very limited number of images that are already well protected, and it just says, is this the right image, yes or no, and then it moves to the next person and it discards that. That to me is a benefit for security, but also a benefit for privacy. We have others with, as you mentioned, our CT scanners. We just have incredibly powerful capabilities to scan the things that are going through airports with new images and computed tomography. If you aren't familiar, it's kind of the same thing as you would have in a hospital, but it's for baggage, and so you can see, is this an explosive? Is this, something, a prohibited item? It's really impressive, the capability that we get through those. But we aren't actually able to use the full capacity because we aren't able to kind of share those images with CBP yet, for example. We're working on some pilots, but wouldn't it be great if we've got somebody who's got something that we're concerned about in either checked baggage or carry-on baggage, and we say, an algorithm picks up something that might be suspicious, that maybe it's really hard if you see these images. Our TSOs are amazing people, but they're people. And so computers can pick up things that we may not see or we may miss. And wouldn't it be great if we could share that with the department and we could give some more early warning on some of these things that we're not even able to track right now? So that's kind of what's the possible. And a little bit on the downside, because again, it comes back to funding and money. And if we had more resources everyone needs more resources, but if we had just a few more resources, we could really develop some exciting new capabilities.
I think there's a lot of change on the horizon, right? The TMF, the Technology Modernization Fund, is providing some opportunities, but the legacy replacement issue is massive, right?
Yeah.
So Amanda, you're probably seeing that exponentially at the White House and with OMB, and they're, as they build the 25 budget,
right.
What are you seeing in terms of resourcing? That was one of the questions that came up is, how are you going to resource this across the federal government given the astronomical costs of the replacements on some of these?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that in terms of implementation, ONCD is shepherding this process, right? But in coordination with OMB, in coordination with the National Security Council, to ensure that we understand where departments and agencies are at. And so right now we're running a process where we're having those consultations to understand what each department and agency is facing in terms of challenges, opportunities, the current resourcing status within their budget, and their budget requests. And so we're compiling and understanding that information and specifically tagging the initiatives that are outlined in the strategy to those lead departments and agencies. And so identifying, for example, where DHS would be leading on specific initiatives in the strategy, or the FBI maybe on dismantling threat actors, for example. And so as part of that consultative process, we're developing this framework to understand, okay, what are the different initiatives that are already ongoing that we need to require amplifying or moving funding mechanisms, and then what are new initiatives, new programs, things that are being developed in the strategy that haven't been in existence before. And so as part of that, we have this framework that is coming out in the summer, and that will be public facing, right? Where you'll be able to look online and understand and match and see from the strategy's language what initiatives are being driven forth by different federal government entities. But that said, it's not just a federal government effort. We are very closely working with the private sector, working with NGOs, working with other stakeholders, even in the international arena, for example, to understand kind of common challenges and solutions to better match and understand how, for example, other countries might be resourcing. And that's part of this longer-term process that I will say started when we were drafting the strategy. So we really began thinking about implementation from the very get-go, because that's really what it was intended to achieve. Mm-hmm.
Can we stick with that international thread for just a minute? There was a couple of the questions that touched on that. Certainly the Five Eyes, our allies, are involved with TSA and making sure that we're rowing in the same direction on a lot of this. But you mentioned before we came out that even other countries, you guys are helping them design and build their own cyber strategies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. So that's actually something that I do cover pretty closely on the strategy team. So I'm working a lot on our international engagements and specifically Pillar 5's implementation in the strategy. So recognizing that cyberspace is by definition boundaryless, and that many of our allies and partners are facing the same exact kind of challenges and and situations. And so as part of that, we've been really in close consultation with the Five Eyes, but also going out and understanding what countries in, for example, the Global South, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Indo-Pacific are seeing, and to be able to not have to reinvent the wheel when we come across the same exact problems. And so much of that, goes into our regular bilateral engagements. I would just mention I did travel recently to Bogota, Colombia, where the Colombian government is thinking through how to establish a national digital agency and asking those questions of how do we resource, how do we set up an institution. And so I was along with another representative from DHS who was able to speak to kind of the US context and our institutions and how we've approached these challenges. And so part of the strategy in the international context is how do we better engage and create these coalitions that are driving towards the similar kind of values driven vision for the future that we want to achieve, rather than being more of a whack-a-mole approach, kind of just letting the adversary set the agenda of what they want the digital future or cyberspace to look like. And so that's one of the huge changes of the strategy, putting forth our vision for the future.
That's terrific. Connie, our emerging technology always outpaces government's ability to address it, right? Whether it's through policy or legislation. We can't get away from without a question on AI and what you might be seeing, and your thoughts in your writings, because you've written extensively about technology as it relates to policy. What are you seeing on campuses in terms of the acceleration of AI technology thinking, quantum, things that are going to crack codes faster than we may imagine?
Oh, right. So that's kind of a concerning thing, just because there's so many things that depend on encryption right now. That is a big conversation that people are having. What's going to happen? How can we make sure that we have a secure future, especially since everything seems to be connected to that? Also with AI in the classroom, the first thing I think of is ChatGPT. This is something that everybody's been talking about, is just even the AI with ChatGPT and just the things that people are talking about that are possible now, and how much easier it is when you have something like AI to help you get to that next step, but also ways that people can use AI to be disruptive, to dismantle things, to cause problems. The dark web, there are already forces in the dark web, malign actors that use AI to further their objectives. So it's something that can be used as a tool, and it's something that could be used to benefit us in the future, and I think we need to embrace that. But it's also something we need to pay attention to how others might use it. And the algorithms aren't always predictable. So that's the other part of it, is being able to understand some of that as well. To be able to get reliability and to understand how it works. We need more people there.
Excellent. Amanda and Meg, same kind of question. Ann Neuberger came out with a statement last week about 6G, that the U.S. was not going to miss the boat on 6G. They were going to be out in front on this, where you've got other countries around the world that were very aggressive, and that we were kind of playing catch up in some of that with Huawei and some of the other issues that arose in terms of infrastructure purchases that were made. You're thinking about just the emerging technologies. Is there a strategy or a thought at the White House and at TSA about how to address these things as they kind of rocket forward?
Yes, definitely, in a word. So we are very cognizant of kind of the emerging challenges, be they in the realm of AI or quantum, right? Looking at post-quantum cryptography. And so I would say, that is a process that we are engaged at the White House with many colleagues from, NSC, Pound Cyber, to the, Office of Science and Technology Policy, right, which has been very forward-leaning in terms of AI and Declaration or Bill of Rights there. And so I'd say, we are very much looking at these problems, and I think within the U.S. government, developing kind of what is our what are our objectives, what are the outcomes that we want to see with these emerging technologies. And so that is an ongoing conversation and kind of policy development process that the interagency is really engaged on. And so, yeah, if Meg wants to add on to that.
Sure, I would say that obviously as cities become smarter with 5G connectivity, there is some hope that eventually it will enable real-time video sharing, so that would be significant for the transportation sector, whether it be trains or similar. Also, unmanned aerial systems, for example. So that real-time video could enable everything from better health care and delivery of blood, for example, through to wildfire fighting efforts. So there are some real positive efforts there. 6G with the sensors would probably help us significantly in some other areas, but again, bring their own connectivity challenges. So TSA is part of the interagency working group that Congress created recently on advanced air mobility. And so as we have more electrification of vehicles that are flying, whether they're for people or cargo, we will need to be thinking about the considerations in the near and longer term. Those are expected to have many uses. Because they're electric, they're a lot quieter, so that means there'll be a lot more of them. And so how do we think through both the capability in supporting this advancement that will help economically, but also make sure that we're, again, back to the security by design, how do we make sure that those capabilities are really where we think that they should be and we're not, again, playing catch up?
Connie?
Oh, no, I was just thinking the same thing, is that, as much as we advance and push things to market, and if we're not building that security in by design, then all those wonderful things still have, opportunities. Again, that's where my mind goes, is, how can it be used in a way that we have to be concerned about, and then we have to, because with opportunity, there's that risk. Mm-hmm. And I love this idea of thinking about security by design and thinking about building those foundations in so that we can have these great opportunities, but also have the security that we should have going along with that.
All of you have alluded to this issue of implementation and the challenges that sometimes present when you're looking across 16 critical infrastructure areas. CISA is looking to develop a systemically important entities list. How do you move down this track? I mean, with TSA, you've got a piece of it, but there's 15 others out there.
Yes.
And Amanda, you're trying to go across all of these and work with Congress to get additional authorities where necessary. How do you see the path kind of evolving in the next couple of steps on this?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to continue kind of the approach that we took with the strategy and with kind of our interagency processes to date in terms of critical infrastructure sectors. So making sure that we're being as consultative and as collaborative as possible. I think that, in terms of current critical infrastructure sectors, we see, different requirements and different kind of standards and whatnot. And so understanding how do we harmonize, I think, is a really key piece of that puzzle that ONCD is very, very interested in kind of driving forward to ensure that we have lessons learned taken from the experiences of other sectors, for example, TSA, when we're looking at sectors that may have been less regulated in the past, such as the water sector, for example, or K through 12 education, et cetera. So those are the kind of things that we're taking into account as we look forward to the future.
Connie, Meg?
What she said.
And it's not going to always be a one-size-fits-all when you talk about the critical infrastructure. I was thinking about, I was reminded of what Robert Lee, who works a lot, he's with a company called Dragos, and they work with the energy sector. And one of the things that he said that both of you have kind of also alluded to is just the idea of being able to talk and have conversations with the people across the public and private sector so that you're having that conversation. Because he just testified before Congress recently about the energy sector and implemented regulation and what that would look like and how to partner with the private sector, which was really rewarding. And again, that was that collaboration, that conversation, that understanding what's important to that business or to that critical infrastructure owner, those types of things. And telling them not, I think Meg was talking about the prescriptive part of it, not being prescriptive, not saying how to do this, and that might be different. It depends on who you're talking to, but not being prescriptive, but saying this is the outcome that we're looking for, and help us get there, and how can we get there? So the whole idea about a lot of people in cybersecurity talk about this idea of compliance versus security. You can do all the things, but is that really making you more secure? So those are some of the conversations that between the public and private sector or with critical infrastructure owners that could be also important in shaping some of the direction in the future.
Excellent. In our last couple of minutes here, just a general question for the group. Are we doing better? I mean, all of us have been practitioners involved in this for a long time. Is the needle moving? Can you tell this time that we're going to make progress in fending off the attacks, but also being preventive about them?
I'll just start, and I'll say, I've seen some dramatic changes, and that's where we've kind of started in this conversation, and where the threat's going, how cybersecurity has evolved. So while it has significantly improved, it's a moving target, and our adversaries know that. So we always have to be nimble.
Yeah, I would say that I am an optimist, and so I think that is part of my ethos, and I think you see that also in our office and kind of where we're at in this current decisive moment in history, and I think you hear that from the president and kind of how we have the opportunity to make the really important decisions now that will enable a more equitable, more resilient, secure digital future for all communities in the United States. And so I believe very much that we are on the up and up and moving towards that goal.
Connie, last word?
I would say yes, I agree we're moving in the right direction, and we're moving in a strong direction, and I like the ideas of what everyone's looking at right now in leadership and where we're taking it. I also am sort of an optimist, but I remember Keith Alexander saying we're going from disruptive to destructive, and that's where it's been, and the attackers are getting more sophisticated, we're more connected, so we have a lot of work to do. So I lean towards optimism, but yeah, carry a big stick, because we really have a lot of work to do. And but I think we've got a lot of smart people who are working on the problems. So. Well,
speaking of smart people, I think you all agree that this is an incredible program that GW has put together on very short notice with really stellar speakers across corporations, academia, government, and it's really been a worthwhile discussion. So please join me in thanking Meg and Amanda and Connie.